Buenas tardes a todos.
Good afternoon to everyone.
Buenas tardes, vamos a comenzar la sesión.
We're going to start the afternoon session. And right, I would like to thank first our generous public for their attendance, and I'm very happy that this seminar, even if condensed, has been so popular. As we reflect on the subject or the suggestions made by our exhibition, the Art and Al-Andalus, the Power of the Alhambra. As a member of the Curators Committee and one of the organizers of the exhibition, I'm very happy to have here Mr. Eduardo López Busquet, the director of Casa Árabe, and the fact that such an important institution dedicated to the relationships between Spain and the Arab world has become interested in this exhibition and the setup of these conferences, which, as our colleague Rafael López Guzmán said this morning, take place at different weeks in Casa Árabe de Madrid. Of course, I want to thank the Council of the Alhambra, also the Legado Andalusí, the Andalusian Legacy Foundation. We have Inmaculada Gutiérrez here, the true soul of the organization of these gathering of artifacts, objects and works of art at the Palace of Charles V. So maybe tomorrow we will be able to visit in one of these 3 days. And I would like to introduce our colleague, even if there's no need to introduce him because of his trajectory. He's quite known from the time he worked for the Town Council of Granada and also as a professor and researcher of the School of Arab Studies. As you know, he's an architect and also a specialist in Andalusian architecture and specifically with everything having to do with the architectural heritage of Granada, of the Islamic period. Antonio Orihuela has published many different papers and books. He became specialized in a specific fashion in habitat, not just in the city of Granada, but also in terms of the restoration of a series of Moresque homes, Islamic Granadinian homes, both also in the area, the urban area of the Alhambra. Also, he's prepared a book on homes and palaces of the 15th century. It's been edited by Legacy of Al-Andalus. And also, I like very much his book on water depots, the aljibes of the Alhambra, that he did together with Antonio Orihuela. So, because of his knowledge, because of belonging to the team, the archaeology team of the School of Arab Studies of Granada, together with Antonio Almagro, who's with us today here, and who will also be speaking to us tomorrow, Julio Navarro and other colleagues. We asked him to develop a specific participation in our seminar on the catalogue. In case some of you have visited the exhibition, you will see a wonderful recreation made by Antonio Orihuela, Antonio Almagro, and other members of the restoration project of the Cuarto Real de Santo Domingo, the royal halls of Santo Domingo. He's also studied city walls, cemeteries, necropolis, water depots, and he's been working on the whole of the heritage of Islamic period in Granada, also researching into the names and the name designation of these sites and monuments. For those of you who would like to better know the content of these talks, most of them have got to do with contributions by the speakers, which are covered by this catalogue of the exhibition. And for that, we ask Antonio Orihuela to do a summary, a depiction of the evolution of the elements, the core elements of this urban tissue of Islamic Granada. So I'll leave you with Antonio now. I'll give the floor to him straight away, and I'm sure we will enjoy his presentation. Thank you, José Miguel. I wanted to thank the curators of the exhibition. The name it has in Spanish, comisarios, like commissars. I don't like it, but anyway, let's stick to curators. I've been working with these colleagues for many years, so it's always a pleasure to develop these kind of activities with them. The conference it will be following its the current title, The Evolution of Granada between the Ziri and Nasrid periods. But of course, we've got to think of its starts, because we cannot just get back to the year 2013 as if it was an empty space, as if there was nothing in this area. Let's look into the maps of those specialists in the Iberian period, headed by Andrés Adroer, who archaeologically have detected in the hill we've got right on the other side of these windows in the Albaicín, between the churches of St. Nicholas and St. Michael, San Nicolás y San Miguel, a first and initial settlement, an Iberian oppidum of the 7th century before Christ, made up of squared, rectangular shaped huts and a small wall. On the 3rd century before Christ, enlargement of the settlement took place, and also the walls were reinforced. There's a map of that same team, and they draw in color, in green, those areas where both Iberian and Romans remnants were found. In blue, those corresponding to exclusively Roman remnants, and in beige or light orange, the ones not belonging to any of those periods. So we have depicted that line. The name of the oppidum would be in Turi, and it would cover some 14-15 hectares. Also in the same map, we've got elements having to do with the Iberian walls here in the area where the mosque was built, the new mosque, at the Carmen of La Muralla, the Gallo Street, and the house of the Almirante, and later on another stretch of walls were found there, presumably belonging to that initial higher pressing. Some of those stretches are spectacular. For example, these walls from the area of the mosque, made up of a plinth, made up of very large stones, and then raised with earthen works. That city, with the arrival of the Romans, was modified and entered an Iberian Roman period, and by the mid-1st century became a municipum, the Municipum Florentinum Iliberitanum, or Florentia Iliberitana, depending on the coins and inscriptions, and specialists in Roman times, for example, Orfila and Sotomayor, place in a darker color that perimeter, that area covered by the Roman city. The name, the new name would be Iliberid, replacing the older one of Iturid. And there's always a doubt with regards to the limits of the southern side, if it would follow the San Juan de los Reyes street, or maybe would be running along the Aljibe de Trillo street, which would amount to some 14 hectares. The Roman Forum has been accurately located by the third quarter of the 19th century. They were discovered, but there was a kind of a fraud there, and they were buried again, and for many years that idea disappeared, and then it seems that reality was confused with fantasy. These are a map from the 1765, and they discovered, the archaeologists of that time discovered the main stones of the Forum located there, where the Carmen de la Concepción is, which is a private garden house limited by María Lamia Street, Pilar Sécula, Ribera Gitana, which is a block today, but which in the 19th century was crossed by different streets. This covering of the site, seeming to forget any vestige of them, a large meant that the streets were closed and a large block was created. Since the fall of Roman civilization onto the coming of the Islamic period is a difficult one, but there are some important highlights. For example, the celebration of the Concilium Iliberitanum by the 4th century, the bishop's see being placed in Rome, in this area, also some coins of that time, but also the testimonies of the presence of a strong Jewish community, which indicate that life did not disappear at that time. So city was still alive, and even so, that when the Islamic conquer of the peninsula took place, even if the capital shape of the Cora or of the peninsula was transferred to the city of Elvira, close to the small mountain range of Sierra Elvira, the moment the civil war, there was a outbreak of the civil war with the arrival of Abd al-Rahman I, when he won against the last governor. The chronicles, at least that from Ibn al-Qutiyya, said that that governor, Yusuf al-Kufti, sought refuge in Granada, where he was, and the city was laid siege, and in the end surrendered. So even if Granada was not a capital city, the city itself was able to defend itself so as to force any enemy to lay siege to it. And because of the polysemy of Arab terms defining strong structure or defensive structure, for example, Medina, Hiksen, Kala, the first texts, the sources from the 9th, 10th centuries, mean that Granada is named after those different names, and it's difficult to find out what's the true meaning. For example, the oldest text, those from Ibn al-Khayyam or al-Rafsi, refer to a place called Hifsen, but an older text, the Chronicle on the Conquest of Al-Andalus, written in the 10th century, defined Granada as a Medina. There are some authors like Cristina Soli who interpret that in early stages in Arab literature, older cities, cities coming from ancient times, especially those which were the see of a bishop, even if they became extinct or disappeared, are referred to as a Madinat, even if they are not that big at that time, with the exception of Al-Muñecar, whereas Granada is referred to as Medina, and that might mean that as early as the 10th century there would be a reactivation of life in the old city. On the other hand, archaeological findings made in these last decades, even if in many cases not that much knowledge was drawn after very large investments, have found remnants from the Emiral and Caliphate periods. There you have some of those elements found in the periphery of the city and also inside the city. Even necropolis like the one in the Panaderos Street, that is north from the old Iberian Roman city, a cemetery, a necropolis which was also used during the Caliphal times, and thanks to carbon-14, a 10th century burial has been found. Another necropolis which has been recently discovered in the Maria la Miel Street, where that Iberian wall was found. Also, archaeologists, as a chronology for the first burials, give us centuries 9 and 10. Even if it was entered into abandonment by the 11th century. So we've got a second-rank city, not as important as Elvira, but it was shown that it was demonstrated that it was there, and its area would be some 18 hectares, because of course the wall was discovered running along the San Juan del Reyes Street. So there was the closing of the walls wouldn't be by Aljibe de Trillo, but below. This initial city would have 4 gates, almost following the 4 cardinal axes, and it would be close to the river, which would be the main source of water through a coracha, through a stretch of wall. When in the 13th century the transfer of the capital was made onto Granada, the walls were reinforced. A palatine area for the Ziri power was established in the northwestern area of that precinct, which surprisingly enough is not the highest point, because the area close to the gate of the weights, the Puerta de las Pesas, is higher, and alcazabas usually are located in the higher points. Maybe because the relief over there is more abrupt, and maybe it was the most easily defendable point. The coracha was fundamental because the city at that time had no possibility for wells to be made, because the natural conglomerates of the hill wouldn't allow water to be found unless very deep wells would be made. No, there was any system of water supply through channels. Maybe that would have been a Roman solution, but it's not yet been proven. So, on the basis of that Iberian Roman city, the first Syri city was established, and that Alcazaba should maybe be referred to as the first Medina. It would be consistent to say that during the first two Ziri emirs, Sawi and Habus, the city would be limited to that area, and it would be under Badis in 1038 that the city would spread onto the surrounding area. So we would have some 25 years during which the Medinat would be there. There was a need for a higher mosque to be there. We've got this tower, this almina of the San Jose Church. Maybe it was the location of the former mosque, or maybe the mosque below or underneath the San Miguel Bajo church, following the typical location of the most important mosque of that time. So the current church would preserve that orientation. With regards to Coracha, there are walls going down to the river. There are both written references from the 17th century, and also after a series of prospections and excavations on this home. This would be the convent of the Conception, right beside the Maristan. There an earthen wall would appear there in an opposite direction to the regular walls, limiting the San Juan del Reyes street. This is a text of Luis de Cueva from 1603, and it was said there was a wall of the Alcazaba, and the other two were divided by a wall which ran down through the Concepcion convent, and we may see its foundation. So by the beginning of the 17th century, the foundations of it were found, because the coracha was useful at the very beginning, but the moment the canals were set up, the coracha would lose its value, and logically, of course, this wall right in between the city would be put down and it would disappear with time. The walls of the Ziri time are made up of mortar of lime and stone. That is, the mortar would be a very hard one made out of lime, and also large boulders inside, so they are not made out of earth. We've got a piece of it which acted as the foundation of the late Palace of the Alhambra. Here we may see those large boulders and stones which structure the mortar. Many different elements of these walls have been preserved, some of them integrated into homes or hotels. For example, these in San Juan de los Reyes Street, which was integrated this way. We may see the same building technique which had been used in the Alhambra area, or maybe at the San Juan de los Reyes Street, there's a corner tower which is being preserved, embedded into this apartment block, the two stretches of the corners and the tower itself. You may see it there. Also, with that same building technique, a series of very interesting elements have been found. there's a drain pipe, which is of course very important for city walls not to suffer from running water in the streets. Starting in the 13th century, the city would grow down to the flatland. The kingdom had become consolidated. They had conquered neighboring areas, so they decided to enlarge the city, a decision which is still valid because the heart of the city is the same that was prevailing in the second half of the 13th century. Also, the river was crossed in order to link the wall up to a small bulwark which was on the hill of the Alhambra. It was a hill the same height of the primitive city, so it would be a dangerous place if it was not for a connection to be established, because it could be a strategic point for any enemies. So this building should be finished by the end of the 11th century. It will follow the details, the information given in the memories of the Emir al-Abdallah when he described the works he started concerning the possible fighting with the Almoravids and forecasting it. The Axares district in that area, by the end of the 11th century and the beginning of the 12th century, was a very adequate area for the spreading onto the city, so it would be a strange configuration if this area would have been left uninhabited. Remnants from the 11th century have already been found. There were some parallel running streets interpreted by Julio Navarro as the remains of old orchards watered by a canal, because irrigated orchards usually need of a certain standardization, regularity. So this city enjoyed a constant supply of water around approximately the end of the 11th century. At that time, it would be logical to think that canals coming from the Darro River would be already in place, and also, of course, the Enadamar canal, which was fundamental for the life in the upper part of the city. This canal, coming from some 11 kilometers away from the city, maybe was working in Roman times and then disappeared to be recovered again, because otherwise it would have been difficult for the pottery factories of the area of La Cartuja to be active at that time, because water is very much needed for pottery factories, of course. And also the information we have on the other canals, the Acequia Gorda, seemed to be started by Al-Qudal, who was a top officer of the last times of the Ziri period and the beginning of the Almoravid. And also there are testimonies that another top officer, Muammal, who died around the same time, built a branch of that canal towards the city in order to water the left side of the city, where he built a public fountain at the Alfares gate. That initial Medina and that second period of the Medina are referred to in a different fashion. For example, in Abdallah's memories, when the Almoravid Emir is about to enter the city, he ordered the Berber soldiers, most of them senators, that those of them who would be in the upper city, close to the Alcazar or protecting the last Ziri Emir, that upper city would be transferred down slope, so the king would be on his own when the enemies would enter the city. So the defensive ability, if Abdallah would be there with soldiers, it would be difficult for the city to be taken. But if soldiers following the Almoravid emir's orders would go down, then the king would surrender. The city, including the Axares district, would cover some 83 hectares, which is quite an area for the time. With regards to new cemeteries, Royal Ziri Rauda was created. It's not been yet found, but logically it should be either inside the Alcazar itself or close by where Badis was buried. He died in 1063. Then the large cemetery of Granada was consolidated in towards the northwest, and as Mola cemetery was established close to the Mauror Gate, or the Gate of the Sun. Among the few buildings which can be located around the 11th century, apart from the alminar of the San Jose Church, we have the 5-arch bridge of the Genil River, made up of sandstone blocks. Even if you go into the internet, you'll find it described as a Roman bridge, which is not. Right, if we go into the 12th century with the Almoravids and Almohads, the city doesn't grow much, because it is seen that this large Medina had not become dense enough during the second half of the 11th century, so there was space enough. There are also interesting processes, for example, with the Casa de los Trustees of the 11th century, a series of pottery workshops were found. They were transferred to the district of the potters by the end of the 11th century. So as the city became more dense, some industries were expelled to the outskirts of the city. So the settlement in this city was started, and also establishment of orchards, because also a canal was found in the Acequia del Cadí from the Genil River, running in parallel to the Acequia Gorda, but at a higher level. Another cemetery was found, the Savica Cemetery, on the sides of the ravine of that same name. And let's see now which are the walls attributed to this period. From the Almoravid period, a strengthening of the walls was made. A special tax was imposed in order to finance the works on new walls, and at that initial area and that initial precinct where that Iberian Roman walls were, which were reinforced by the Ziri time, a new outer wall was built. So for some time the two walls were active. So building the outer wall would mean the other one being abandoned, because there are some breaches on link-up points which would allow going from one of the passages to the next. The walls seen today is the only one seen today is the outer one, because the inner one is buried. This is the outer walls, which is very powerful, 10 meter high, more than 10 meters high, and between 2 and 3 meters thick. And you may see that the building technique is completely different. It's cheaper and faster, so it's more elaborate, which is the calicostrada earth work. It's made with lime, and a crust is made, so it's got an outside hardened surface, but the inside is more earthy, with not much lime, with not that much coarse sandy material. So very large stretches of walls could be made in a short time and with not a very large investment. This technique became imposed with time, and it was the same used by the Nasrids up to their last works.
So we here have a view. This is a stretch of 350 meters that goes parallel to the Cava Street, between the Monita Gate and the Las Pesas Gate. And here we have a frontal view from the San Cristobal viewpoint, and here we see part of the outer walls. In some areas we still have remains of the decorations with white strips and marking some false blocks. And we also see this tower, one of the two towers that have been preserved from the inner walls, and this is a corner wall of the Zirid Alcazar, and it is later reinforced by these additional walls, and you can see that reinforcement marked on the map with the violet or color. So it was a tower used to control the Alcazar. It is still the seat of power for Almohads and Almoravids in the 13th century and 12th centuries, and here we need very high towers necessary, so everything could be controlled, including the upper areas. The other great defensive contribution done during this period was the building of pre-wall. This is a wall, in fact, that was built in front of the wall, but of a lower height. In the areas where topography would not offer defense, between the Elvira Gate and the gate situated in the Trinidad Square. And this is a hypothesis that we suggested some years ago, and this was even published in a map that dates from 2001. And then later we found archaeological proofs of this in the street Almona del Boquerón, in the street Cochera de Santa Paula, in the convent of Encarnación, and the street Silencio too. We're going to see a couple of examples of this. Here, this is the street Silencio, and we see the inner wall, and in an area where there was a tower, and there's a black wall, pre-wall, and then the wall is also reinforced with some additional stretches because it was too thin. We see in red the wall with the corner tower, and in yellow this pre-wall that was built in front of the wall, and then also the reinforcement of that wall. And here we have the view from the convent of La Encarnación, and here we see the wall, a tower, and the pre-wall or wall before the main wall. And here again we see the reinforcement of this rampart, reinforcement that was added to the exterior of the wall. It's not like in Seville, where we see the pre-wall coming closer to the wall. Here we see about 80 centimeters between the two walls, the minimum distance to allow for a person to walk in between. Since 1232, when Muhammad I founded a new power of the third Taifa kingdom, a few years later, in 1238, more or less, he was called to come to Granada in order to establish the capital city of his territory in Granada. And according to chronicles, it is said that he entered the city and he was established in the 11th and 12th century Alcázar. But sometime later he decides that that site is not sufficiently safe, and therefore decides to create a Palatine city in the opposite hill, following a very common tradition in the Arab world. And in Al-Andalus we see an example of that in Medina al-Thahara, where we see that the power creates a city for itself in order to be better protected, surrounded by loyal people, military people, people from the government and some handicraft communities. And the idea is to be surrounded by the city. According to our hypothesis, both cities, Granada and the Alhambra, would be situated side by side, and they would be linked by the stronghold of the Alcazaba. Then the outskirts start growing, the areas of Los Alfareros, the pottery neighborhood, and La Loma too. And then in the northern area we have the Albaicin outskirt, and then later on towards the west, the Rambla outskirt. So the Acequia Real is built because this was a very arid hill, and water was necessary in order to build these walls with lime, this lime crust I mentioned, and a lot of water is necessary, therefore that the canal of Acequia Gorda was built. And then new cemeteries were established, like the one in the neighborhood of the potteries, where the Campo del Príncipe square is now situated, and also an old cemetery that had been previously been in use in the late Roman period in the Albaicin area. Well, this old cemetery in the street of Panaderos is in fact covered, and new houses are built there. And this was discovered in the excavations between Plaza Larga and the street Fuerteventura, and there we find the old cemetery that was covered to build houses, and another cemetery was built instead in the slope of San Miguel Alto. At the end of the 13th century, the neighborhood of the potteries of Los Alfareros was protected by a wall, and the total surface was of about 105 hectares. The northern limit of this rampart is quite hypothetical because we have not found any remains, only in the southern section. And then during 2 centuries and a half we see the growth of the city, and in the period of Yusuf I the rampart of the Albaicín is built, it becomes another neighborhood, although it was nearly an independent city with its own Al-Jama mosque and its own Kabi, and a lot of independence. Therefore, there were 3 Al-Jama mosques at the same time, one in Granada, another one in the Albaicín. The one in Granada dates from the 11th century. And as I say, the Albaicín one is placed in the where we now have the San Salvador's church. And there was another one, yet another one. The Alhambra had about 10 hectares, and added to the rest of the areas. We are talking about quite a big city for the time. At an unknown moment, in order to be able to irrigate the upper areas above the orchards covered by the Acequia Real, we have a branch, which is the 3rd branch, as it's called, La Acequia del Tercio, that goes to an upper area, and we see the apparition of other cemeteries. We have the Royal Rhoda in the Alhambra, and it is likely that with Ismail I, with the change of dynasty, the Nasrid sultans started being buried within the complex. And then we see the appearance of the cemetery outside of the walls in the Los Abogados ravine, and then another cemetery for foreigners that has been located on the opposite side of the Genil River, in the site where the San Antón el Viejo hermitage was built later on. The urban structure of the city, due to the complexity and durability of the different areas, we see that there were different connecting points. Here we have them in yellow, going from the gates, main gates, towards the commercial areas. In general, those main connecting routes go towards the Al-Jama mosque, but in the case of Granada, this mosque is situated right to the outer side of the city, and we now have the Plaza Nueva, the square. That was a wide commercial area. Here in violet, we have all the commercial areas, the area situated around the Elvira Street, and there was also in the Panaderos Street, we still have another commercial area. And there were also some areas where there were some potters, and then another handicraft area close to the Hafalauza gate. Regarding, well, this was the capital of the last emirate of Al-Andalus, and here we have the Elbanistan, the hospital. Here there's a hypothesis of a reconstruction carried out in the School of Arab Studies. Then we have the madrasa built by Yusuf I, the Alcaiceria, which was not single element. We found other examples in Almería, Malaga, or Galez, Malaga, but the one in Granada was the widest, the biggest one. And there was a fire in the 19th century when it was destroyed, and here we have a map of it where you can see the urban representation of the Alcaiceria, and then also the Al-Ondiga, which were in fact quite common, but the only one that was kept was the one in Granada, and it was in fact very similar from the technical point of view to the Maristan, it was an exchange. The construction system was the same. So we've covered the neighborhoods. The Albaicin one was protected by walls during the Yusuf the first period. Here we see that the walls are weaker in this case in comparison to the Alcazaba ones that date from the 12th century. Here we have like 1 meter wide, more or less, and here we see some of the gates, and these walls were also not as high as the ones from the Alcazaba. And in the Potter's neighborhood, here we have the southern wall, which is the only one preserved. And nowadays, what we see from this royal building is not the original tower. These maps have recently been published where we can see the original tower with a dome that was not so big to begin with, and then it was expanded in order to increase this royal tower. It's like what happens with the Tower of Comares. We have a small tower and then it is covered in order to create another one. And the exterior covering is made out of this lime crust, but the internal tower in fact was built with older techniques, more solid techniques. Although we do consider that this transformation was quite quick, and the transformation was carried out only a few decades after the original tower was built. In the Nasrid, Granada, we see a very original water distribution system. Water coming from the source of Alcázar, the Darro River and the Genel River. And these are very high quality waters and also permanent waters, because these sources of water are permanent even during the summer. And we've been able to check this distribution because most of these irrigation canals are currently in use, and Almaidanar was a drinking water canal that was used until 1950. So since the 11th century until the 1950s, the water drunk by people in the Albaicin was supplied by this irrigation canal, so a very important heritage really. And linked to this canal system, there is also a network of reservoirs or deposits, and 28 of them have been preserved, many of them in the Albaicin neighborhood. Within the city, of course, many more existed, but of course they have disappeared with time, but we still have a registry of them in the documentation. In order to find something similar to this, we would need to go to Tetuan, where there is a water system that is still being used, or perhaps in Fez with a great public fountain system. But in Al-Andalus there was nothing similar to this, and this year, with the 20th anniversary of the inscription of the Albaicin in the World Heritage List, these reservoirs or deposits have not yet been considered as an asset of cultural interest, because the current management plan dates from the year 1990 and they were not valued at the time. So we hope that they will get protection soon. Here we see the different types of deposits or reservoirs with several sections or just one. 300 cubic meters. This is the biggest reservoir, and it is open to public visit because it is kept by the foundation called Water of Granada. This is a beautiful image I would like to share with you to finish with. And here we see that we've reinforced the color of the walls, the ramparts here. So we see that in the 16th century the city had spread, and in the end of the 15th century the city had about 70,000 inhabitants, which is a lot for the time. One of the cities with the greatest number of inhabitants in Spain and in Europe. Thank you very much.